at least under this roof, there's one daughter who finally did something right. My mother said it with her arm wrapped around my younger sister, the new VP of marketing, the one whose engagement photos took up an entire mantle, and then she turned and looked at me the way you'd look at a parking ticket. 41 people went quiet on that patio in Charlotte. 41 pairs of eyes locked onto the woman standing by the drink cooler in plain khakis, holding a sweet tea she hadn't touched. My mother pressed each word slow, like she was nailing them into wood. 42 years old, no husband, no children, still wearing a government badge like it means something. Tell me again what exactly you do for the Department of Veterans Affairs, honey, because I've forgotten. 20 people laughed. Not nervous laughter, permission laughter, the kind that only happens once the queen bee fires the first shot and everyone realizes it's safer to laugh along than to be the one left standing alone in silence. I didn't flinch. I looked past my mother's lipstick, past the rosé flush on her cheeks, past 4 decades of her deciding I was the disappointment, and I said one word, reckoning. A wine glass shattered on the flagstone behind me. At the patio bar, a man in his late 60s, broad shoulders, silver buzz cut, forearms like braided rope, went stiff. His glass had slipped right out of his hand. I'd noticed him earlier, standing off to the side, nursing a bourbon and not saying much to anyone. Now his face had drained of color like someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind his eyes. "Say that again," he said. His voice came out low and cracked, like gravel under a tire. I said it again. Reckoning. He set his glass down, what was left of it, and without asking anyone's permission, he crossed the patio in 4 long strides, stopped in front of me, and stood up straight as a flagpole. Then he saluted, not a casual nod. A full, formal salute, chin tucked, palm flat, the kind you give to a superior officer at a change of command. The laughter died where it was standing. But before I tell you why a retired federal judge who'd spent 30 years on the bench without losing his composure once was suddenly trembling in my mother's backyard, and why she paid for every single one of those laughs before the night was over, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes, nobody in that yard saw coming. The man, I'd find out later his name was Walt Dunmore, retired from the Eastern District federal bench, lowered his hand and turned to face my mother. There was nothing polite left in his eyes, none of the courtesy a guest is supposed to extend a host. "Margaret," he said, and the way he said her name made her flinch. "Do you have any idea who this woman is?" My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Walt reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, soft at the corners, the kind of folder that's been opened and closed 100 times. He laid it flat on the patio table and spread out a stack of court transcripts and newspaper clippings, all stamped, all official, all redacted in places where names had been blacked out by people whose job it was to protect identities. But he'd circled details on every single page, case numbers, dates, the words whistleblower protection underlined twice in red pen. "Every time one of these crossed my desk for the last 6 years," he said, voice still rough, "I knew. Nobody else did. But I knew." The laughter hadn't fully died. It had frozen mid-breath. 41 people stood in my mother's backyard, knowing less about their own blood relative than a stranger holding a folder of legal paper. I said nothing. I picked my tea up off the table, set it back down exactly where the ring already was. I wasn't looking at Walt. I wasn't looking at my mother. I was doing what I always do in a room that's about to go sideways. I was reading exits. Who's looking for the door? Who's waiting for me to lose it so they can call me dramatic later? My cousin Tessa? No, wait, that's not. My cousin in the blue dress had her phone in her hand, thumb hovering over the screen like she wanted to text someone but couldn't decide what to say. My uncle, the loudest logger 30 seconds earlier, was suddenly very interested in his own shoes. My mother recovered first. She always does. "Walt, I appreciate the theatrics," she said, voice dropping into that syrup and pity register she uses on people she thinks are too simple to follow her. But Diane has always had a flair for inflating her own importance. Even as a girl, she lived in her own little world. A ripple of relieved laughter went through the crowd. People grateful someone had diffused it before it got real. My sister jumped in right on cue, eyebrows knit in performed concern. "Are you okay, Diane? You seem really stressed." That question was surgical. It repositioned me in one sentence, from a woman a federal judge had just saluted, to a woman who needed to be checked on, not respected, managed, not a professional, a patient. I picked my tea back up, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds held, 4 seconds out. The verse came the way it always does, not in words exactly, just a feeling underneath my ribs. Who shall I send and who will go for us? I stood. I walked over to Walt and shook hand, firm, eye level. "Thank you for being here, Judge Dunmore." Just enough emphasis that anyone paying attention would know I knew exactly who he was. He leaned in close, voice dropping below the noise of the party. "Whitcomb's getting an award next month. Charlotte Bar Association, Lifetime Achievement, Black Tie Dinner downtown. Funded partly by a foundation set up in honor of the people he ruined." He paused. "You should be there." I nodded once. The campaign had begun. I didn't go inside the house after the cookout ended. I sat in my car in front of my mother's driveway, engine off, hands resting on the wheel at 10 and 2, like I still did flight checks out of habit, even 6 years after I'd left the cockpit of federal courtrooms behind a desk job in Inspector General's office. When I reached over to grab my purse, my hand brushed against a folded photograph my mother had left on the passenger seat days earlier and I'd never bothered to throw out. A family photo from the year I turned 16. My mother in the center, arm around my sister's shoulders, 12 relatives clustered close like petals around the center of a flower. I was at the far edge of the frame, no hand on my shoulder, body angled slightly away, not because I'd chosen to stand apart, but because by the time I got into frame, every spot near the center was already taken. I looked at my own 16-year-old eyes in that photo, not sad, not angry, just flat. The face of someone who'd already learned that being overlooked wasn't an event. It was just the weather you lived in. The memories didn't come back in order, they came in pieces. The year I made law review, my mother didn't ask the date of the banquet, didn't write it on her calendar, didn't mention it to a single relative. The year my sister got engaged, my mother threw a dinner 2 weeks in advance, booked the private room at the country club, called every cousin personally. The year I mailed home a photo of myself being sworn in as an assistant U.S. attorney, my mother put the envelope in a drawer without opening it. The year my sister bought her first condo, my mother posted it on Facebook with the caption, "So proud of my girl, not once, not an accident." A pattern, maintained with clockwork precision across decades, never missing a beat. My sister was seen, I was tolerated. The sharpest memory, I was 19, standing in our kitchen, announcing I'd gotten into a top-tier law school on a partial scholarship. My mother didn't get angry, she got sorry for me. Soft voice, almost sweet, the tone you'd use telling someone about a diagnosis. "Oh honey, girls who go into law because they don't have any other options, that's who ends up there." Not an attack, a verdict delivered before any evidence had been heard. "You failed at something else first, so you're settling for this." My sister was at the counter painting her nails and didn't even look up. She never needed to. My mother held the knife. My sister just held the door open. That was the first time I understood, with total clarity, that my mother hadn't just doubted me. She'd decided long before I was old enough to prove anything that this particular daughter had no future worth investing in. The decision was made once, and in 23 years, it was never revised. I put the photograph in the glove compartment, didn't throw it away. Kept it the way you keep evidence you might need later. I remembered a line a mentor of mine, a retired federal prosecutor, used to say, "The truth doesn't need volume, it just needs time." I'd lived by that for 6 years. Every case I closed, every fraud I unwound, every dollar I clawed back for the taxpayers was an answer that didn't need words. But after that name had left my lips at the cookout and Walt had whispered about the dinner downtown, something shifted. Not inside me, around me. This time the truth wasn't going to get folded up and put back in a drawer for another decade. It had been there the whole time, waiting in the corner of every quiet room. 6 years ago, late October. I was 36, 2 years into a position at the Office of Inspector General, assigned to a federal contracting fraud case that had been sitting untouched for 18 months because the man at the center of it had too many friends in too many high places. Marcus Whitcomb, senior federal judge, Eastern District, 41 years on the bench, the kind of man who got introduced at banquets with a 15-minute list of accomplishments before anyone said his name. What nobody outside a tight circle knew was that Whitcomb had been taking kickbacks for over a decade, steering contracts toward a shell company run by his brother-in-law, padding invoices for consultant work that never happened, draining federal infrastructure funds meant for rural courthouse renovations. I'd found the pattern almost by accident, cross-referencing wire transfers nobody thought to connect. When I brought it to my supervisor, he told me to drop it. Politely, then less politely. Then he told me directly that pursuing a sitting federal judge without ironclad proof would end my career before it started. I didn't drop it. I spent 11 months building the case in my off hours, after my actual assigned caseload, sometimes until 2 in the morning at my kitchen table with case files spread out like a crime scene. I found a paralegal, Renata, who worked in records, who'd noticed the same discrepancies and had been too afraid to say anything because Whitcomb had quietly ended 2 other careers that had gotten too close to the truth. She fed me documentation. I built the timeline. By month 9, I had enough to take to the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section without my own supervisor's blessing. 3 days after I filed the referral, the retaliation started. My access to certain case files got revoked pending review. An anonymous complaint appeared in my personnel file alleging I'd mishandled evidence, a complaint that turned out to trace back to a clerk who worked directly under Whitcomb. A reporter from a regional outlet ran a story sourced anonymously, painting me as an overzealous junior investigator chasing headlines, reckless, possibly unstable, possibly motivated by a grudge nobody could substantiate. Nobody asked Renata what she'd seen. Nobody printed that I'd recovered over $4 million in misappropriated funds. The story had already been written before the facts arrived. I called my mother that week, the only time in my adult life I'd cried to her on the phone, not as an investigator, not as an attorney. As a daughter, sitting on the edge of my bed at 11 at night, asking the woman who raised me to say 3 words. I believe you. She listened to the whole thing. The case, the retaliation, the article, Whitcomb's name. She didn't interrupt once, and for one fragile second I let myself think, maybe this is the thing. Maybe hearing your kid's voice break is the sound that finally gets through. She waited until I'd stopped crying. Then she said flat, almost bored, I told you law was going to chew you up. You should have gone into something stable like your sister. Then she hung up. No goodbye. Just dead air where her voice had been a second earlier. 2 days after that, the man I'd been engaged to for 8 months called, not to ask if I was okay, not to ask if the article was true, not to say he knew me well enough to know it wasn't. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to issue some kind of public statement clarifying things, because his firm's clients had started asking questions, and it was becoming a liability. He never said sorry. He said he needed this resolved before it affected his partnership track. We weren't engaged anymore by the end of that call. The only person who held the line was a woman named Renata Okafor. No, that's not. Was a senior inspector general named Carol Brandt, who pulled me into a windowless office at headquarters, locked the door, and told me flatly that I wasn't being fired. I was being reassigned to a classified unit where my name would disappear from every system Whitcomb's people could access. You don't need vindication today, she told me. You need to survive long enough to be vindicated later, and when that day comes, I'll be standing right next to you. That's not a favor. That's an order. Understood? Understood, I said. Whitcomb retired quietly 8 months later, not forced out, just stepping down to spend more time with family, the press release said. The investigation went cold on paper, sealed under an ongoing matter designation that meant nothing could be discussed publicly. For 6 years, I watched him collect honorary dinners and Bar Association awards, while the case that should have ended his career sat buried in a federal database, accessible to almost no one. I sat in my car outside my mother's house, 6 years of silence stacked behind me like sediment. In that whole stretch of time, she had never once asked how I survived the article, the broken engagement, the nights I sat alone wondering if I'd ruined my own life chasing a case nobody wanted me to chase. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not on a single birthday. But Walt Dunmore had kept every clipping. Carol Brandt had kept her word. And Renata still sent me a card every December with nothing inside but her name, because she remembered exactly what it cost both of us to tell the truth. The dinner in Charlotte was 3 weeks away. Memory, I was about to learn, comes with interest. The crowd at the cookout scattered into uncomfortable little clusters after that, nobody quite sure how to process what they'd just watched. My mother went inside without another word to anyone. I was pulling my keys out when Walt fell into step beside me on the way to my car, the way one person who's been through something falls in beside another without needing an invitation. You don't owe anyone an explanation tonight, he said. I just wanted you to know I never stopped paying attention. He held the folder out to me. I took it. Inside, beneath the clippings, was a single-typed page. A declassified summary memo, dated 2 months earlier, confirming the case had finally been fully sealed after the statute review expired. Whitcomb's name was no longer redacted. How long have you had this? I asked. Long enough to know it was you the whole time, he said. I sat on plenty of cases that cross-reference yours over the years. Never said anything because saying something before it was safe would have ended you for good. But I kept everything. Figured someday somebody should be able to prove you were right. Something tightened in my chest. Not sadness, recognition. While my mother was telling guests I'd always had a flair for drama, while my ex-fiancé was worrying about his partnership track, a federal judge I barely knew had spent 6 years quietly preserving the truth because it was the right thing to do. I drove home and didn't sleep much. At 1 in the morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open under a small lamp, the same way I used to work the case in the first place. I thought about the dinner downtown, about Whitcomb accepting another award funded, this time, by a legal foundation set up in his own name. Money he'd helped raise off the same reputation he'd spent decades polishing while quietly stealing from courthouses that needed roofs and wiring repairs. I called Carol Brandt. She picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. I wondered when you'd call, she said. The Whitcomb file's been fully declassified for 2 months. I was going to bring it to you myself next week. I want to be there when he accepts that award, I said. There was a pause, then the sound of her exhaling slowly. I'll be in the front row, she said. Front row, and I'm bringing the file. 3 weeks later, the Charlotte Bar Association's annual dinner filled the ballroom of a downtown hotel with chandeliers and white tablecloths and the particular smell of expensive wine and cologne that fills rooms where people have never had to question whether they belonged there. I wore a charcoal suit, not because I needed to make a statement with fabric, but because it was the only language everyone in that room would immediately understand. Competence, seriousness, somebody not to be dismissed. A man near the entrance, lanyard swinging, gave me a once-over. "I don't think I have you on the list." "I'm not on the list," I said. "I'm a witness." He didn't know what to do with that, so he let me pass. Across the room, Whitcomb held court near the bar, silver-haired, easy posture, the comfort of a man who'd been honored so many times he'd started mistaking the ritual for proof of his own goodness. His eyes caught mine from 15 feet away, and the color drained from his face the way it does when blood drops somewhere south of the heart. He recognized me instantly, the woman whose career he'd tried to bury, standing in his ballroom in a suit that said I wasn't going anywhere. He crossed over before the program started, because he couldn't stand the idea of not controlling the moment. "Diane," he said, hand extended, voice warm and entirely false. "It's been a long time. You're looking well." I let the silence stretch 3 full seconds before I answered. "Long enough to remember every detail of what you did, Judge." The word judge in my mouth carried exactly the weight he didn't want it to carry anymore. His hand dropped. He turned and walked back to the front of the room, shoulders locked higher than before, no longer strolling like a man at home. The program opened. The MC introduced Whitcomb with a recitation of 41 years of distinguished service, integrity, dedication to the rule of law. Every syllable landed like an insult to everyone in that room who'd actually lived by those words. I sat with my spine straight, eyes locked on him, not blinking. He felt it. I watched his hand tighten on the podium edge every time his gaze swept past my table. "There are those," he said, voice sliding into a tone of practiced sorrow, "who, when they fail to advance in this profession, choose instead to manufacture conspiracies. They mistake their own shortcomings for persecution." He looked directly at me when he said it. A chair scraped against the floor. Walt Dunmore stood, one hand braced on the table, 68 years old and standing as straight as a man half his age. "I read every page of that case," he said. No microphone, didn't need one. His voice filled the room the way poured concrete fills a mold. 4 million taxpayer dollars. Courthouses with leaking roofs because the money meant to fix them went into a shell company run by your wife's brother. I read the wire transfers myself. The murmur that went through the room wasn't quiet. It was 200 people recalculating everything they thought they'd just heard. Carol Brandt stood up from the front row, unhurried, the deliberate movement of a woman who'd waited 6 years for this exact moment. "The Whitcomb matter was fully declassified 2 months ago," she announced, voice carrying to every wall without amplification. Wire transfer records, internal audit findings, and the original referral filed by Assistant Inspector Diane. She said my last name clearly, the one my mother had never once said with pride in 30 years. "Have all been entered into the public record as of this morning." Whitcomb's face had gone gray. His knuckles were white against the podium. Then a man near the back stood, gray-haired, in a wheelchair, a courthouse maintenance supervisor I recognized from a deposition years earlier. "I filed 3 separate maintenance requests for that roof," he said, voice shaking but carrying. "Told it wasn't in the budget. I lost my job 2 years later for asking too many questions about where the renovation money went. One by one, people I'd interviewed years ago, people whose names had been scrubbed from public reporting to protect them, stood up around that ballroom and said what they'd actually seen. I stood, heels together. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. From the edge of my vision, I saw my mother standing near the back entrance. She'd come, apparently invited by Whitcomb's wife, a social obligation she couldn't have anticipated turning into this. She had one hand pressed flat against her mouth, tears running down her face, watching the daughter she'd told a backyard full of people had a flair for drama being vindicated in front of 200 witnesses with documentation that couldn't be argued with. 3 days after that dinner, there were 3 knocks on my front door, soft, uncertain. I checked the peephole. My mother stood on the step, no makeup, hair pulled back plainly, holding a tin of the lemon shortbread cookies she only ever baked for my sister's birthday every year, without fail. I recognized the tin immediately. In 42 years, she had never once brought me those cookies. I opened the door, didn't step back, just stood in the frame. "Diane," she said, voice breaking on the first syllable. "I didn't know." I looked at her, not angry, not satisfied, just still. "You didn't know, or you chose not to believe me. You had my number every single year I was being torn apart over that case. You chose not to use it." She reached for my arm. I stepped back 1 pace, nothing dramatic. "You don't need a chance to understand me," I said. "You need a chance to feel better about yourself. Those are 2 different things," she cried, the way someone cries when shame finally catches up with them. I let her cry. Then I said, "Please go home, Mom, and don't come back," not in anger. In the voice of someone who'd arrived at that decision, across 6 years of quiet thought, not one bad night. I closed the door. The deadbolt turned dry and final. That same week, Whitcomb asked to meet me at a diner off the interstate, vinyl booths, coffee that had clearly been sitting on the burner too long. No robe, no gavel, just a 71-year-old man across a plastic table from the woman whose life he'd tried to dismantle. He admitted all of it, voice shaking so badly his coffee cup rattled against the saucer. When he finished, he asked the only question he had left. Why didn't you come forward sooner, publicly, I mean? You had it all 6 years ago. I looked at him, calm. Because bitterness is dead weight on a long climb. I spent those 6 years getting stronger instead of getting loud. Every case I closed after that, every dollar I clawed back for people who'll never know my name, all of it happened because I refused to let you be the whole story of my career. I stood up, put cash on the table, and walked out without looking back. A few weeks later, Walt called, not about Whitcomb, not about my mother. Just a quiet voice asking if I wanted to come speak to a group he ran on Thursday nights. Young attorneys and investigators who'd hit a wall trying to do the right thing inside systems built to protect the wrong people. I went. Folding chairs, bad coffee, a box of cheap cookies on a side table. No agenda, just people with cracks in their armor sitting together because the alternative was cracking alone. A young woman in the corner, maybe 26, kept her eyes on the floor the whole meeting. I recognized the posture. It was mine 6 years ago. When the floor opened up, I stood without notes. The hardest part isn't the fight, I said. It's coming home afterward and convincing yourself isolation will protect you. It won't. The most dangerous thing you'll ever face is the voice telling you that you don't deserve to feel okay again. She looked up. Is it true what they call you? That you're the one who took down a federal judge by yourself? I smiled. Not the courtroom smile, not the satisfied smile. The first real one in longer than I could remember. I didn't do it by myself, I said, but yes. And the name doesn't mean what they think it means. It means I go back into the dark for the people who got left there. That's all it ever meant. Driving home that night, windows down, no radio, I thought about my mother sitting alone in that house, where the family photo still hung on the wall, me at the very edge of the frame. I wondered if she'd taken it down. I decided it didn't matter anymore. I thought about every version of the hell I'd walked through, the article, the engagement that ended over the phone, the silence of a mother who chose a stranger's anonymous quote over her own daughter's voice, the laughter of 41 people who shared blood with me but never once had my back. And I'd walked myself out of every one of those, not because someone rescued me, but because I decided every single day for 6 years that I was worth the walk. The quiet in the car wasn't loneliness anymore. It was the silence that comes after the dust settles and you realize you're still standing, still whole, finally home, not to a house, not to a family that never earned the word, but home to myself.